We are live from the Action Network studio in New York City. Welcome to Green Dot Daily, presented by BetMGM. I'm Maria Marino, along with our special guests, Anthony Dabbundo and Mike Calabrese. They are the college basketball experts, so they will be analyzing the men's bracket and giving us a bunch of tips. We'll also have Megan Gower from her Hoop Stats drop by with some thoughts on the women's tournament, Gilles Gallant with NBA, Nick Martin on the NHL. We have a completely loaded show, you guys. And that's not all. Some news to note in the NFL. So let's get to that. Quarterback Jimmy Garoppolo is reportedly signing with the Raiders on a 3-year deal worth $67.5 million, $34 million guaranteed. Odds have not moved since this development. So the Raiders are at plus 4,000 to win a Super Bowl, plus 2,200 to win the AFC, and plus 1,400 to win the West. By the way, Monday is the start of the legal tampering period in the NFL. No deal is final until Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern, which is when free agency officially opens. But enough of that, okay? It's March Madness. We want to talk about March Madness, and Anthony and Breeze, we had a Selection Sunday reaction to the bracket. But now that you've had a bit of time to process, are there any lines that you want to bet on now? Breeze, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I want to just pounce on the Wildcats of Arizona, laying 13.5. It's still out there in the market. It's bubbling up to 14.5. I think this is going to close closer to 16. And the reason I feel that way is 86% of the money thus far is on the Wildcats. And they're up against a Princeton team that's to travel across the country and play in Sacramento. So from a travel perspective, not great for the Ivy League champs. Additionally, in terms of the actual game flow in this position, Tosan Awoma, their point forward for Princeton, he's going to be overwhelmed by two incredible bigs from Arizona. That's Tubelis as well as Ballo. They're both top 30 in overall player efficiency. I think Princeton's going to find themselves in the deep end of the pool here, try to get into a shootout in the second half. I think Arizona's going to run away from them. So getting the best number means a lot in these early round games because there's a lot of big numbers out there on a point spread basis. I'm going to go ahead and play Arizona minus 13.5 here.
Meanwhile, you have a line to wait on as well, is that right?
So another one that currently is a pass for me is Kent State getting 4.5 against Indiana. This is one of those public versus non-public team situations. IU is a high-scoring offense. They have an All-American in Trace Jackson Davis. I think they're going to get a lot of steam here at the end. If this number closes closer to 5.5, 6, the Golden Flashes are a good value, but at 4.5, it's a pass for me.
Let's talk some general strategy, Anthony. Are there certain angles you look for when dissecting these matchups?
Yeah, I think we fall in love with certain teams based on big home wins that they're able to get throughout the course of the season, and going on the road in conference is really difficult to do for a lot of these teams. But there are some teams that I think get overvalued and overseeded based on their resumes at home. NC State is a team, for example, that didn't really beat a tournament team either on a neutral court or on the road all season. Now they're expected to go to a neutral court in a pretty friendly Creighton environment and play them. There's some teams, and there's a metric that Eric Haslam from Haslametrics has, and it's an away from home rating. So how did you perform relative to expectations at home versus away from home? And there are some teams in this field that are the most reliant on home court we've seen in the whole country. You know, Bradley is number one. They went 0-3 against the spread in the conference tournament on a neutral court. Iowa, Tennessee, Kansas State, St. Mary's, Baylor, all teams that fit that criteria in the top 20-ish teams in terms of relying on their big home performances to carry and buoy their underlying numbers, their metrics, and eventually their seed. St. Mary's beating Gonzaga at home. We saw Tennessee beat Alabama. Iowa's always dangerous shooting at home. But what do they do on neutral courts and road environments? It's not quite as good. And so I think those are the kind of teams that you can pick off when they go play in a foreign gym that they haven't played in before, and maybe they don't get the home whistle quite as much.
What about for you, Breeze? Some rules of thumb, things to look out for?
So since 2014, when you look at the 4 teams that are traveling the furthest to play in their first round pods, only a 39% hit rate against the spread when traveling those long distances. Who does that impact? I brought up Princeton earlier. Let's also look on the reverse West Coast to East Coast trip that St. Mary is traveling all the way up to upstate New York to play in Albany against VCU. That's a tough spot for them. On top of it, compounding the issue, it's a body clock spot. So they're going to be playing at 11 a.m. body clock time for them at 2 p.m. Friday on the East Coast. These are things to consider. Additionally, not many St. Mary fans are going to travel all the way to New York State Capitol. So I think that's an issue for the Gales. Also, just from a player perspective, if the team that you're picking is really dependent on one superstar, with only 5 fouls in college basketball, it can seem a little bit obvious. But if they pick up too early and go to the bench, you want to race to that live bet opportunity to either hedge out, or if you are in the other spot, kind of doubling down and going after a team that's vulnerable with their star player on the bench.
The body clock thing is still an issue for all of us, I think, coming off daylight savings time. But as you mentioned, just a lot of situational elements, the travel, the officiating impact, all of that is important. Guys, give me one other pick you like so far in the first round. Anthony, we'll start with you.
Yeah, this is the first pick that jumped out to me when the bracket was released, and I was hoping to get a bad Missouri perimeter defense in the first round against a good shooting team. It's exactly what we got. Utah State, look, the Mountain West has been really bad in the tournament in the last 4 to 5 years. They have 1 total win, so that's not great in terms of forecasting as a conference. But every team is different, and every year is different. And this Utah State team has the perimeter shooting to expose Missouri. Missouri allowed the 5th most unguarded three-pointers in the country this year. They were really bad defensively on the perimeter, and that was in the SEC, where they didn't face a lot of good shooting teams. So now Utah State, elite offense, much better defense that they've played in the last month. Since February 12th, they're a top 25 team efficiency-wise overall and top 50 defensively, which is where they can struggle a little bit. Missouri certainly has some advantages. There will be plenty of runs back and forth in this game because of just how much these two teams love to shoot. But I think ultimately the Aggies are the clearly better team and should be laying 2.5, not the current 1 pick'em that you can see out there in the market.
Very good. And what do you got?
So UCLA is wounded coming into the tournament. They lose Jalen Clark, the Defensive Player of the Year in the Pac-12. Dabbundo is probably going to be limited in terms of his availability and how much he's going to impact their front court play. That's great news for the 15 seed. UNC Asheville catching 18.5. This is another number I would go ahead and pounce on right now. Drew Pember is playing at a borderline All-American level. He started his career at Tennessee. He was a hometown kid from Knoxville, ends up not seeing the court, so goes to the transfer portal, goes to Asheville. He's averaging close to 22 and 9 per game. He's really impactful on the defensive end. And the same thing that I talked about situationally, if he goes to the bench early, this is a dead bet. But if he's able to play, score 30 plus, when you pair that with a top 10 three-point shooting percentage team in the whole country, which are the Bulldogs, I think they're going to be a live dog here. And finally, UCLA's Mick Cronin has 6 first-round exits in the round of 64 during his career, so he's not a stranger to bowing out early in the NCAA tournament.
Very interesting. Okay, Anthony Dabbundo, Mike Calabrese, thanks for the insight. Thanks for being with me here in studio. You can catch these two again on our Cinderella Draft show. That's today at 6 on the Action app and the YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys.
Looking forward to it.
Green Dot Daily has a reminder by BetMGM. Bonus code ACTION when signing up. Get up to $1,000 paid back in bonus bets if you don't win your first bet. Terms and conditions apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Sticking with March Madness, the women's basketball bracket was revealed Sunday night, and as expected, undefeated South Carolina is the top overall seed. They are favored to win it all at -165. The next best odds belong to Stanford and UConn at +700, followed by Indiana at +800, then Iowa and LSU have longer odds. Let's welcome in women's basketball analyst for her hoop stats, Megan Gower. Megan, it's so great to have you. You wrote an article in the Washington Post outlining which teams actually have a shot to win a championship besides South Carolina. So what were your findings?
Yeah, so if you look back at all the tournaments back to 2009, 2010, the winner of that tournament has had a top 10 her hoop stats offensive rating and her hoop stats defensive rating for the season. So it's basically their offensive rating and defensive rating adjusted for the same strength of schedule. And there's 5 teams this season that meet that criteria. It's South Carolina, of course, they're actually first in both. And then UConn, Indiana, Stanford, and LSU round out that top 5.
But you're not as confident about LSU. Why is that?
Yeah, LSU, as much as they have that rating, it kind of comes down to they've built that on a very weak strength of schedule. They played one of the worst non-conference schedules in the country this year, and then ran through an SEC slate pretty comfortably, but the SEC had a bit of a down year on the women's side. this season, so they haven't faced a ton of top competition. They've played just 3 games against current AP top 25 teams, South Carolina and Tennessee. They're 1-2 in those games, and just can't see a team with that strength of schedule being able to make a deep run in March.
They're a 3 seed, and by the way, sportsbooks seem to agree with you. They have Iowa a 2 seed as well, at better odds to win a championship than LSU. What does that tell you about Iowa?
Yeah, I think part of it is just Iowa has looked so good lately. Caitlin Clark is one of the most exciting players in the country, and she really turned that on, especially in the Big Ten tournament. And Iowa went on to win that in one of the toughest leagues in the country. And their offense also just looks even better. It's already really good, but it looks even better lately because it's not just Caitlin Clark and it's not just their center, Monica Sonato. It's all 5 starters really getting in on the offense.
Well, I want to ask you about Virginia Tech as well, because they've had an amazing season. They're another 1 seed, but their odds are much more of a stretch to win a championship. What's going into that thinking, and why someone like UConn, for instance, could still have the advantage to win it all as a 2 seed?
Yeah, I think it's 2 things. One, Virginia Tech kind of came on the scene a little bit late. They weren't maybe really in that conversation for a 1 seed 3 weeks ago, weren't really in the conversation as a title contender, but finished out their regular season and conference tournament 11-0. So they've really made a streak over the last few weeks. And then also being paired with UConn. I think UConn, one of the hottest teams in the country right now. They just got AZ Fudd back. So having that matchup in your region, even though UConn is the 2 seed, I think you're seeing that in the odds there.
Yeah, and I also think that just the history of UConn having made it to 14 straight Final Fours and the consistency of the coaching staff, people probably just feel like in general they're a good bet to make it at least that far again. All right, Megan, thank you so much for the preview of the women's tourney. We appreciate you stopping by.
Thanks, Maria.
All right, still more basketball to get into, but this time we go NBA. And a great tool to look for in the Action app with a pro account is a system for grading top props. For instance, we see Desmond Bane here with a grade of B+ to go over 2.5 threes made. And it's 3 p.m. somewhere, so naturally we have to bring in Gilles Gallant to share which bets he likes in regard to 3-pointers made. In fact, Jill, you are on Desmond Bane going over 2.5. Tell us why.
Yeah, Maria, I didn't even know that the pro account had that as the lean. Had I known that, that would make me feel even more confident in the pick. But yeah, Desmond Bane over 2.5 3-pointers, seeing it at -120, so I locked that in. Bane leads the team in 3-point shooting, 7 attempts per game on 41% shooting, especially on the road. He's averaging 3 makes per road game this season, and he's hit this in 5 of 7 road games since the start of February and 7 of the last 10 on the road overall. So again, just Bane has really been successful shooting a 3-pointer in road games. Now playing against a Mavericks team that has just been in flux, especially since the Kyrie Irving trade. Since he's joined the team on February 8th, they've had a lot of struggles to contain opposing guards. They allow the 3rd most attempts per game to opposing guards and the 5th most makes per game to opposing guards. So I feel like Desmond Bane, this is a huge and awesome matchup for him. I'm seeing that prop, around -135 in some spots. So I feel like -120, solid value for Desmond Bane to get 3 or more 3-pointers against the Mavericks.
For sure. And what else do you like for this evening's slate?
Well, we joked about it off air about how we love to take Jimmy Butler. I'm actually going to stray away from Jimmy. I don't want to do it a 3rd show in a row to take Jimmy. So we're going to take Tyler Herro instead at over 2.5 3-pointers at -130. And the volume is there. He ranks top 10 in both 3-point attempts, 3-point makes. He's just over 3 makes per game. And since the All-Star break, been red hot. He has hit this in 7 of 10 games since the break. And as I mentioned, the volume is kind of what keeps bringing me back, because he leads the team with 8.2 attempts per game, facing a Jazz team that is this close to being in the tank window here. They're 27th in the NBA in opponent 3-point makes and 3-point attempts. And with Harrow, part of the reason why we wanted to grab this is where the odds are. So, for example, the last game against the Magic for the same line, he was around minus 145. Game before that against Cleveland, he was at minus 160. And I'm seeing it around minus 150 at some spots. So getting it at minus 130 for him to hit this mark, much better value here. So Tyler Harrow is one of those. And another one, we're going to take a plus money one, though, Maria. I'm looking at Jason Tatum. Over 3.5 3-pointers at plus 105. And last week when I was on the Buckets podcast as part of the Action Network podcast, I gave out Buddy Hield at over 3.5 3-pointers made against this Rockets defense. Well, he had 4 by midway through the third quarter. And the reason being is because the Rockets defense is just trash when it comes to defending the perimeter. They allow the most 3-point shots, the most 3-point makes, their last at 3-point percentage. Like if there's a defensive metric for Houston defending the 3, like you got to look immediately to the bottom of the page. So when you're looking at a matchup like this, especially against this Rockets defense, you want to take the guy who's obviously taking the most 3-pointers on the team, and that is Jason Tatum, who is 5th in the league in attempts per game and 6th in makes. He's also hit this mark in 4 of the last 5 games. And one of the things that I look at, Maria, too, is how do snipers go against this defense? And if you look at the top 3-point shooters who have the same or similar type of attempts as Jason Tatum, like a Klay Thompson, Steph Curry, Dame Lillard, Fred VanVleet, or Buddy Hield, as I just mentioned, all of those guys have hit 5 or more 3-pointers in this matchup. Even when Tatum played him earlier in the year, he went 6 for 10 from 3 points. So for me, Jason Tatum and Tyler Harrow are the other two that I'm adding to my card along with Desmond Bane.
Okay, so I know you have a process that you go through when you're trying to determine which of these props look appealing to you. We could probably do an entire show on it, but if you had to give me just an abridged version, what would you say?
Yeah, it would be 3:00 next day by the time we were done talking about it. But yeah, how I view them, there's 4 key things that I like to look at. Obviously, volume. Some of these are going to be pretty obvious too, Maria, but I think it's good to reiterate for people betting this market. Volume, 3-point shots versus their total shots. So what kind of splits are they looking at? The defensive matchups, and then of course recent splits of the last 5 to 10 games. So we'll go through this each one here, but the volume is key because it's volume over 3-point percentage for sure, because a guy could be shooting 50% from 3-point, but he just doesn't take a lot of shots. Like your margin for error just plummets if he's not taking them. So like a PJ Tucker, for example, a guy I love to bet, hits around 50% of his 3-point shots, but he just won't shoot it. Some games, like last game, I bet him to hit 2 and hit 1. He didn't even take a shot, played 30 minutes. So that's the kind of thing that you have to kind of consider, is that 3-point shot percentage isn't as valuable as the volume itself. Now, the 3-point shot versus total shots, what I mean by that is I always like to look at guys at where do their total shots come from? Is it mostly from 3? Is it a little portion from 3? Like the magic number that I look at is if you take 100 shots, if you're taking 60 of those from 3-point range, that's a perfect metric that you want to look at. Guys that typically fall into that category are like a Buddy Hield, another guy that's near and dear to my heart, Pat Connaughton from the Milwaukee Bucks, another guy who takes around 55 to 60% of all of his shots from 3-point range. And there are certain guys that you can get away with that, like Steph, Klay, or Dame. They're actually under 50% of their total shots come from 3, but their volume is so high that you can get away with it because their lines will typically reflect over under 4.5 3-pointers, that kind of thing. And then a third factor is defensive matchups and targeting players with that high volume. So defenses like the Rockets, the Kings, the Bulls, the Thunder, they're all great matchups that you want to bet 3-point props against. But if you take like a dominant team, like a Denver Nuggets or, Boston Celtics to a lesser extent, but like the chances for a blowout increases. So while we might see that star player get 3 or 4 3-pointers, he might not play the fourth quarter because they're already leading by 20. So it's just something that you have to consider when you look at that matchup. And then, of course, recent splits, just even seeing like how the team is playing, like, these are just crucial to being able to look at that. Like, how is the team defending the perimeter? Are they allowing a lot of attempts, or are they just allowing good shots? The player you're betting on, is he firmly in the rotation, or is he just kind of making his way in and maybe playing 15 to 20 minutes a game? It can get tricky for taking players that are on tanking teams as well, because you don't know what the rotations are. And that sometimes these teams, they'll be trying to get a guy more minutes just to see what he can do. And then another factor is, how does a player fare when a certain teammate is out? So going back to Desmond Bane, when Ja Morant is out, he has hit this point prop in 6 of 9 games without Josh. So I think that's the key thing here is volume, what your shot splits are, 3-point shots versus total shots, the defensive matchups, and of course, recent splits of 5 to 10 game sample sizes.
We appreciate the condensed tutorial. I will do like a follow-up where you can quiz me at a later date to see how much of that I retained, but I think I got it. Very useful advice, as always, from Gilles Gallant. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot, Maria. See you again next week.
Let's turn our attention to the NHL, and a key matchup Monday is Dallas at Seattle, 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Most of the money is coming in on the Dallas money line. Most bets and money also falling on the over 6.5 goals, and 70% of bets are on Seattle against the spread. And with that, we bring in our Action NHL writer, Nick Martin. Nick, good to see you again. Tell us why you're eyeing this matchup in particular and how you decide whether or not to place a wager on it.
Yeah, so this just comes down to price for me. So we're getting a pretty good number with Seattle at plus 105. These teams just met on Saturday, and it was a really closely contested game. If anything, I thought Seattle was slightly sharper side. They kind of have a reputation, especially with the public right now, as being fraudulent. A lot of it has to do with how they came into the season. They were viewed as a team that was potentially going to be a lottery team. So I think they're still a little underrated. And Dallas has been struggling for what has kind of became a relatively large sample. They've had a really hard time keeping the puck out of their net. Their star goaltender hasn't been as sharp as usual. So I think when we consider that these teams just played how that game looked, this is just a good price to back the Kraken. With that said, I would like to have confirmation of Martin Jones being Philip Grubauer being their starter, because it does seem like one where they might lean towards giving Martin Jones a start because of how long he's rested.
And in general, the NHL doesn't require teams, of course, to officially release who will be in goal. So give us some factors that you look out for in terms of that goalie situation and how that affects your betting goals as well.
Right. So the goaltending situation, it annoys a lot of NHL bettors because they don't like the late confirmations. They don't like the late scratches. But I think a lot of people look at it the wrong way because it's an excellent way that you can gain some value with some assumptions about tendencies teams have. And then you try to get on the lines early and get some good closing line value. So this one's a bit odd for me because typically I would say my strategy is more to get it in early and make assumptions. But like I said, I think this one we could see Seattle go off the rails a little bit and go with Martin Jones just because of how long it has been since he started, which scares me a little bit. But the main angle and kind of the most obvious one that I'd say people want to get used to is good teams and teams that aren't desperate for wins aren't going to go back to back with their starters almost ever. So you can jump the gun and bet the night before if you kind of anticipate that correctly. And then a lot of time you're going to get some good line value. So a team like Tampa, for instance, with their star, Andrei Vasilevsky, he never goes back to back. They have no reason to go back to back with him. You can get injured. They're rarely playing for anything in the regular season. So why do it? You might as well manage his minutes. Yet I still see people like kind of waiting for that official word. And then the lines still seem to move sometimes, especially totals. So if he plays the night before, they have a game the next night, you don't need to wait for that confirmation. They're going with Brian Elliott, and that's kind of been the whole thing with this regime. And that's a pretty league-wide thing. Like, for example, with this game, Dallas hasn't officially confirmed Jake Ettinger will go tonight. But if he does, we can assume that tomorrow night it'll be backup Matt Murray because the games, they're just not that relevant to them. And there's a pretty large sample of data saying that this is a smarter way to do it. You need to manage your goaltender's minutes. So teams that are already well situated, they're not desperate for points, we can kind of safely assume that this is the way it's going to go.
Definitely really great advice. You have to strike a balance, but it sounds like you just need to know your teams, know the scheduling, and just try to anticipate as best you can. Before we let you go, there is a prop on the board for this evening in the NHL that you like. Care to share?
Yeah, so I'm going to go with Cale Makar to record 4 shots versus Montreal. This is a really good matchup for Makar. Montreal takes a ton of penalties. They allow a lot of shots to defenders, which makes sense when you look at their roster just because it's so depleted. They don't have a lot of NHL talent, so they're never likely to hold the puck much, which is great. And they like to sag below the puck, which is awesome for Makar. He's going to spend a lot of time with the puck on his stick at the blue line. So I love that. Makar, to go down narrative street a little bit too, he's one of the best players in the league. I don't think anyone would dispute that. He called himself out for being the common denominator in Avalanche's losses since he returned, which I don't think was necessarily true, but everyone knows this is one of the most talented players in the league. And he's been absolutely dominant over the last 3. He's had 22 shot attempts. So I think in this matchup, it's really likely he's going to see that kind of volume. And if he does have that level of volume, it's more likely than plus 100, I think, that he goes over 3.5.
Sounds good, Nick. Enjoy the games tonight, and thanks for stopping by.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
In addition to what you just heard from Nick for the NHL, we had a bunch of men's basketball picks for first round of the tournament and some NBA props on the show today. Remember, you can keep track of all our expert picks by following Green Dot Daily in the Action app. Green Dot Daily is presented by BetMGM. Use bonus code ACTION when signing up to get up to $1,000 paid back in bonus bets if you don't win your first bet. Terms and conditions apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. That's going to do it for the show. I'm Maria Marino. Thanks so much for watching. You can catch us every weekday at 3 Eastern on the Action app and the Action Network YouTube channel. I'll see you again tomorrow.